All right, so our topic today is effective strategies for teaching writing to basic literacy adult learners. And Anne-Marie, as I said, is going to be presenting it. Before we get into the content, we have just a little bit of logistics. So Anne-Marie, if you'll go to the next slide. So those of you who have attended our webinars before, we're going to ask that you use the chat to introduce yourself and share links and resources with the group. You can use it to ask questions of the group as we go through the webinar. If Anne-Marie mentions resources, Danielle will be posting those links in the chat. But we will ask that if you have questions during the webinar that you would like to pose to Anne-Marie, please use the Q&A feature to type those questions in. The reason for that is the chat just kind of scrolls really quickly, and a lot of times we miss the questions that you asked in the chat. So please put them in the Q&A. It lets us track if they've been answered or not, and then we can make sure everybody's questions get answered. Anne-Marie, if you'll advance. We are recording this, so in about a week, you're going to get a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording. You're going to get the slideshow that Anne-Marie uses today. You're also going to get a summary sheet of kind of the key points that she's talking about, a transcript of the chat, a transcript of the Q&A, and their certificate for participating in the webinar. You'll see on the right-hand side that there is a listing of dates for the coaching sessions. So these are small group coaching sessions. This is a new format that we are testing now. So you're also going to get an email about a week after the webinar with links to sign up for a small group coaching session. And Anne-Marie, if you'll forward to the next one, we'll talk a little bit about what those are. There we go. So small group coaching sessions, like I said, they're scheduled about 2 to 4 weeks out after the webinar. And what they're really designed to do is give you an opportunity to reflect on what you learned in the webinar, maybe start to utilize some of the things that Anne-Marie is going to talk about. And then if you have additional questions, it's an opportunity for you to sign up and really talk to Anne-Marie some more and get her to answer your questions. So small groups, so specific times, we vary the times of day and the days of the week, up to 10 participants. And everybody kind of comes in, and Anne-Marie starts with one person, asks them their question. Anne-Marie talks about it. A lot of times she draws on the other participants in the group to provide solutions, but it's just a great way to get additional support. Anne-Marie, I know you had a lot of the coaching sessions after your first webinar. You want to talk a little bit about that experience and kind of share maybe an example of a conversation that you remember having off of that first one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Todd. One of the things that I most enjoyed about the coaching sessions was that people were able to not only interact with each other, as Todd said, but come with specific questions related to the content of the webinar or the unique situation of working with their individual student or class. And it was a real gift to hear from longtime experienced volunteers, tutors, teachers, as well as meeting many newly trained teachers and volunteers who had questions about how to get started. And for that purpose, I wanted to specifically say that I am a big fan of starting the coaching sessions about a week, no more than 2 weeks after this webinar, because I know that a lot of the questions people had after the reading one was about how to get started, or more specifically about some of the strategies that I shared. So I'm very happy to follow up with people via email after the coaching sessions. And I always say that the greatest body of wisdom is everybody together. So I hope that you'll find the coaching sessions valuable. And I look forward to delving deeper into some of these strategies and your opportunity to implement them or tweak them and customize them for your unique situation.
Perfect. Perfect. You want to advance to the next slide?
Sure.
I think this is where we turn things over to you. Yes. So
Okay.
Anne Marie, if you want to introduce yourself and then take over from here, that would be great.
Thank you so very much. It's my pleasure to be here with everybody today. And I think that I'll just very briefly say about myself that I did start in the field of adult literacy as a volunteer in 1992. I had been a teacher, a trained high school teacher prior to that. And I've been enriched and very fortunate to have had this as my career for over 30 years. My very favorite thing to do as part of teaching within the field of literacy is working with teachers and volunteers. So this is quite an honor. And I just had noticed that there is a person named Jessica from Wyndham Adult Education in Maine. I am coming to you from Maine, and that was the program that I started volunteering in. So that's a nice come around full circle experience for me. In regard to writing, I've taught writing for many years, and I just wanted to say that during the pandemic, like many people, I started picking up writing again, not just letter writing and more personal things, but the kind of writing that I hadn't done in quite a while. So I've always enjoyed writing, and I hope that you have some things that you can take away from this webinar. I hope that you get confirmation and reaffirmed for things that you're already doing. And I hope that you find things that are quickly and easily implementable. Those are my goals for today. So the first thing I'd like you to do is start by writing. Do you believe that writing is an art or a science? Would you write your response in the chat with your reason or reasons why in just a couple of sentences, please? Got very quiet all of a sudden. Okay, thank you. I'm not getting a lot of support. I'm seeing a lot of topic sentences. I see a lot of people that are saying both, which is probably how I would answer this question as well. I really like the reasons. One that really resonated with me is that it's an art because of the creativity and the soul, my word, that goes into it, but a science because we rely on the research and what we know as best practice to teach it and implement. I love what everybody's saying about writing and that you're already writing. So one of the things you'll learn about me is that I like to do a lot of modeling, and I always start a writing class with some sort of a prompt to get people writing right away, usually an opinion piece. Thank you so much for answering this question. I'm going to move forward, but I assure you that I'm going to come back and look more closely at your responses. They are rich and quite telling as to who is attending this webinar. So the first thing I want to do is just quickly go through the agenda. And what you'll see is that there's nothing on the screen just yet because I've never actually done this before, but I'm going to start by sharing what we won't be covering today. Even though I think these are important aspects of teaching writing, I invite you to extrapolate for your situation based on the strategies I will share. And of course, we can use coaching time to delve into these issues based on your interest or question. I also want to just put out a reminder that the focus on this webinar is intermediate level literacy learners. We will be covering strategies for lower level learners in the next webinar on April 13th. And as I said earlier, I'm happy to address questions or help you adapt during the coaching sessions, but that's not strictly the content we'll be focusing on in this session. So I won't be sharing genre-specific writing strategies. The focus today will be on what good writing looks like and how to teach to help learners become good writers. But at the same time, really writing is about purpose and audience. So I think that you'll be able to see those adjustments, that tweaks that you would need to make in your situation based on what we cover today. I won't spend much time on mechanics. Grammar, spelling, transitions, they are very important, but I find it more motivating for students to build their voice, their confidence, and a descriptive vocabulary first, so they will want to write. I also balance teaching grammar in isolation with teaching it in context. I identify the discrete lessons I need to teach based on the errors that I see in their writing. I also am only just going to briefly say that I find modeling is extraordinarily important. I won't be spending any more time on that today, but I encourage you to write when your students write and to share both your process and your product with your learners. It's more than a think aloud in this case. It's really writing alongside learners. I won't address writing for pleasure, whether it's creative writing, journaling, letter writing, life story writing, but of course we want to inspire and encourage folks to write about things they enjoy and look forward to the process of writing as well as the final product. I won't be covering writing as a means to improve or assess reading, but I will be addressing that in the next webinar. So let's take a look at what will be covered today. Of course, we're going to touch briefly on the writing process and how in some ways it can be expanded, as well as many, many activities to promote writing. I put correcting writing in quotation marks because there are times when you will, out of necessity or by request, be correcting writing, assessing, evaluating, and sometimes even giving it a grade, even though we're talking about intermediate level learners. But I have some strategies and recommendations around that as well. I learned at the last webinar that the people who stayed the longest and had the most questions were specifically asking about resources that I use or purchase to teach writing. So I've included that at the end of this webinar prior to the Q&A. And of course, that information will be on the summary sheet that you'll get as well. I will be focusing on the fact that writing is a recursive experience. It's not sequential, even though it is often taught that way. It's a developmental process, and when I teach writing, I focus more heavily on the processes than I do, as I said earlier, the mechanics of writing. But there's many times when we go back and forth. Good writing involves collaboration, brainstorming, peer editing, lots of discussion about the topic, about the writing. And I will also be focusing on developing specific writing skills with new, struggling, or reluctant writers, Writing is one of the most humanizing activities we can engage in because words have power. To start, I have a cartoon because when we think about it, oftentimes, our learners have a downright fear of writing. Sometimes they believe they don't have anything to say, or they don't have enough knowledge to ensure accuracy or even agency about writing, while others worry about their spelling and think that it's such an important part of writing, they avoid it. And others simply just don't know how to write, at least not yet. As I did in the reading webinar, I'm going to bust some myths that our learners often have, misconceptions about writing and writers. Oftentimes, they think that the first draft is the final draft, and that's why we need to be very transparent about the writing process. Sometimes they believe that writing is easy and comes naturally for certain people, and I use analogies depending on what I know about my learners, but what comes to mind today is an athlete who may have an inclination or an interest or even not a strong talent, but with practice and dedication, guidance, coaching, they can become very good at something that they enjoy. And writing is the same way. Sometimes a misconception is that writers are excellent at grammar and spelling. And I say to my students, the writers have editors. Even the best writers, the most popular published writers, prolific writers, just like the best golfer in the world still gets a caddy on the course to give input and guidance and coaching, so do writers with their editors. They also think that good writers just sit down and the ideas flow. But we all know that doesn't always work. I like what Steve Schmidt just said, the genius of writing is rewriting. Some people would call it the curse as well, but thank you for adding that. Yes, that's what makes it so much better, rich and robust. I like to introduce writing with intermediate learners at the level of a sentence, because we always want to anchor new learning to what they already know. So I bring a wide variety of examples of a single sentence, a paragraph, a 5-paragraph essay, and a longer piece or a short chapter. And of course, that's done over a period of time. It's important that the texts you select are easy for the learners to read, since the focus is on writing. So we don't want them to have difficulty comprehending the text to be able to look at the piece of writing. So it's okay if this is at a much lower reading level than what they're accustomed to in that class. I explain that a sentence is a single idea with support or development in just a few words. I then show how a paragraph is an expanded sentence. The first sentence typically introduces the main idea, and the following sentences provide examples and details to support it. Then we move on to a 5-paragraph essay together, and I show how it acts as an expanded paragraph where the whole first paragraph introduces the main ideas, and each main idea gets its own supporting paragraph with evidence and rich details prior to the conclusion. Then I have students read the longer text and show me, by citing parts in the text, how the text supports the expansion of the 5-paragraph essay. I find this approach helps to remove some of the anxiety around writing and gives me something to refer back to if a student struggles early on. So this is the scaffolding of introducing the concept of writing. Then, of course, we move on to the writing process. Generally, there are 3 steps to the writing process, but I like to expand it a bit with literacy students. I apologize. No, I need to do this backwards. Thank you for your patience with me. I'm Italian. I was talking with my hands. Sorry about that. As I was saying, of course, we start with pre-writing and move into the writing phase with a first draft. What I like about this graphic is that it makes a distinction between editing and proofreading. While we typically think of the final version as the end of the process, I think it's especially important for adult learners to have an authentic audience for their writing, someone other than their teacher or tutor. So I hope you'll consider ways to publish their work. And of course, the more students read, the more they will have exposure to good writing, different genres and styles of writing, and experience the impact of selecting the precise word to convey a message or idea. So there are so many ways to introduce the writing process. I find that mapping or clustering work best for students new to the writing process, and that's the graphic you'll see on the left. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but I also want to mention that there are some learners who really like to start with free writes, and that's another great pre-writing activity. Another activity I've done to teach organization and supporting details is to facilitate, and this is what my scribbles are on the screen here, is to facilitate a robust brainstorming session and then have learners make a T-chart. To do this, you start by doing a round-robin brainstorming session on your topic. And that means that you go around with each learner giving one idea at a time until no one has anything more to add. And this can happen even if there are just 2 of you, but someone that you're tutoring and you. I always participate in this as well. Once no one has anything more to add, And of course, during the brainstorming, we do not evaluate any of the responses. We just record them on the chart paper. That's the scribbling in the middle of the screen there. I then ask the learners to see if there are any that do not belong, using neutral language related to the topic and not the person whose idea it was. Next, students can use scissors to cut out all the remaining words, and then I ask the students to group them so that like ideas are together. Once all the words are in groups, there's our T chart. So the topic goes at the top of the T, and they group all their words on the left-hand side of the T. And what they need to do is for each group of words, they need to give a name to them. And that name or that title needs to be something that includes and describes all of the words in that group. They can organize them within each group according to grain size. So big ideas become topic sentences and smaller ideas become supporting details. They could also sequence the groups and decide the criteria for putting them in order. It could be importance or chronology or any other thing that is relevant to the topic. This is a great kinesthetic activity and can be tweaked a number of different ways by using sticky notes instead of chart paper. You could give each group a different topic. You could have all the groups brainstorm the same topic and then follow that with a walkabout or a compare and contrast reflection. The groupings now have the content and the first draft language for separate paragraphs. So if you can imagine on the right-hand icon there in that T chart, the topic is at the top and you've got all those cut out or sticky notes with the words for the paragraph on the left side and what they represent or how they're named, why they're grouped that way on the right. I hope that makes sense. And if you have questions or want to try this, I'm happy to continue this conversation in our coaching sessions. Starting at the level of sentence development, there are so many great ways that you can offer strategies in a classroom or volunteer setting to get students started. I really like this graphic on the right, this graphic organizer, because it's identical to the one that I use for a 5-paragraph essay. So there's consistency and familiarity in the graphic organizer for the learners. Of course, we can always analyze sentences from texts, just isolated sentences even, and talk about why they're impactful or why they're not, and how they could be made stronger, especially if you're using all different kinds of texts. The synonym work involves strategies that is anything from having a game about figuring out how many words you can come up with that mean the same or similar thing, how many different ways that you could describe something. It also offers opportunities to talk about how they're different. You can certainly add adjectives, adverbs, action verbs, and dialogue in sentence build-outs. I also like to do things involving the 5 senses for sentence build-outs. So what I mean by that is you start with a very simple sentence, your subject verb, and then you ask the students to then describe what they want to write about, adding what it looks like, what it smells like, what it sounds like, what's textural, and if there's taste involved, description of that as well. Another way to build out sentences is by starting with a short sentence, as I just said, and then adding adjectives, adverbs, changing the verbs from passive to active or making them more descriptive, or even dialogue, and making a very rich, robust, multi-word sentence from something that started out being 3 or 4 words. You can, of course, have words on index cards, and these can be words from your word wall, even from reading. I've in the past color-coded index cards for different parts of speech, and they can be mixed and matched in order to make sentences and get creative. I've often put magnets on the back of those index cards so that individual students can make sentences or show what they're doing on a cookie sheet. And that's something that can be used for phonological and phonemic awareness work as well. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is a graffiti wall. And so everybody can be writing a story, a word at a time, or a sentence at a time together on a big piece of even larger than butcher block paper. But the other thing I like to do is to take a piece of chart paper and have 4 students, one at each corner, and they start writing, each of them at the same time, either with a prompt or of something of their own. That's up to you to decide as the teacher. And each student writes 1 or 2 sentences starting way in the center of the chart paper, but heading towards the corner that they're sitting at, if that makes sense. And then after a couple of sentences, you turn the chart paper to the right, and the next person adds 2 sentences to the previous 2 sentences. And we go around this way until there's a conclusion to the story or they run out of room. And then we use those 4 stories or written texts to evaluate and edit. It's kind of fun to do, a little bit kinesthetic. You can do this with them standing up because you could put certainly 4 pieces of chart paper in different parts of the room. But when they do it at the tables, there's a real nice camaraderie. And I tell them not to worry about spelling or mechanics at that point, but then we turn it all around. And when we're looking at the editing and revising, it's everybody's work. It's not just one person's. So they seem to really enjoy, feel a little less self-conscious about making recommendations for improving that writing. If you're familiar with shape poems, these are the kinds of poems where students would brainstorm all the words to describe. It could be something in nature, it could be an animal, it could be a member of their family, something that represents a memory. Even abstract thoughts can be represented, but I ask them to first list all the words that they can think of to describe that, and then make sentences, but the sentences are written to make the shape of whatever the topic is that they're writing about. And there are excellent examples of these that you can find in books and online. And my students have really enjoyed doing that, especially some of the more artistic ones. And the last one I wanted to mention is that I've done the reverse with sentence work, and instead of having them do the details and explanation of a main idea or topic sentence, I bring in paragraphs or even sentences with just the supporting details or examples, and it's up to the students to write the topic sentence. So here is an example of something that I did when I was teaching a group of, this was a family literacy program. It was a writing class. They were earning high school diploma credit, but were not quite working at high school level, almost. And they were all teen moms. And so one of the things they wanted to study is poetry. And you can only see on the screen the beginning of the poem, Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou. But what I had them do was, of course, we read this and studied it as a poem first. And then I asked them how they would describe themselves as a phenomenal woman. And they each wrote their own poem using their own words. They didn't just substitute their words and use Maya Angelou's, but they mimicked her style. And they found that a really easy way to get writing, because they knew how to change the sentences there They didn't have to worry about rhyming, which, as we know, isn't important in poetry, but sometimes beginning or struggling writers think that it is important. And it introduced them to a poet that they didn't know and wanted to read more of. So you can certainly do this with any number of poets, depending on who your students are and what you think they might be interested in to be introduced in this way. E.E. Cummings is another poet that I've used for introducing writing with intermediate literacy learners. So then we move on to paragraph development. And as I told you, the 5-paragraph essay outline is very easily represented in a number of graphic organizers. But in this instance, I really like the way that they're already familiar with the 1-paragraph graphic organizer. And so they're familiar with how to use this and don't get caught up in the language or the structure of the format. So this is just, again, a list of ways to incorporate strategies for helping learners develop paragraphs. And one of the things that I found to be particularly powerful is photo prompts. Any sort of advertisement in a magazine, of course, now you can find memes online, personal photos. You can also use physical prompts. People bring in things from home. But anything that is a non-written or non-verbal prompt often gets students writing in a way that starting with words doesn't always. And of course, there's no wrong or right way to start or answer those questions. So it just gives us the opportunity to focus on the process of developing a strong paragraph and supporting with rich detail and evidence of your thesis statement or topic sentence. Thank you so much. Steve has just posted 144 picture prompts to inspire student writing. Oh, very recently posted. Thank you. I somehow missed that, and I think that's an excellent resource I'll be sure to include on the summary sheet. And of course, whenever I see things that I think would be a good prompt, I just, pop them in a file and save them. Of course, you can use quotes and all kinds of there are lots and lots of ways to get students writing, but these are some of the more, I would say just some of them are a little out of the box thinking, I guess I would say. Of course, journal writing. And I just want to put a little bit of a caveat on here because it is an excellent way to introduce the writing process at the level of paragraph development. And I always want to make sure that my students know that, first of all, I will not be editing or correcting their journal writing, that I don't always consider a journal to be a personal reflection. It doesn't have to be like a diary. Journal writing can be so much more, but some students want it to be. And there does need to be a conversation about that when you're working with your learners and the kind of information that you might be privy to. So I just give that as a little bit of a heads up if you haven't had that experience yet. But one of the things that I always say to students, in particular when we're looking at journal writing, is that you don't have to write from your own perspective. If you're given a prompt and you're working on developing a certain trait in your writing or practice with your writing within that stage, I always say the writing isn't optional, but whether or not you're coming from your own perspective is optional. And if you want, you can create a character and you make that character and you can do all your prompts or all your journal writing in the voice or experience of that character. And one semester when I did this, the students liked that option so much that they actually wrote for the entire semester with their characters and developed them in an absolutely beautiful and exciting way. Of course, then here are just some other ideas about writing a letter to your future self. Writing a user manual for your family. I've had students really enjoy doing this. And of course, you're probably familiar with rewriting anything that they read from a different perspective, different character, a change in the time period in history when it occurred, a different ending. And so you can see that within these strategies, again, it's really scaffolded so that they don't have to start from scratch on what it is they're writing about. And that's oftentimes where there's a lot of opportunity to get to see how your learners are doing and what kinds of things they need help and feedback on, as well as direct instruction. So within the writing and editing phase, of course, we want students to write, write, write. The more you write, the better you get at it. And good writers write every day. So when we're talking about the editing process, of course, as the instructor or the tutor, we want to make sure that we're able to see where our students are excelling and where they need some work or some direct instruction in terms of a gap that they have not yet been able to incorporate into their writing. I'm sure you're familiar with peer review and editing. And one of the things that I want to say about this is that it's really important to teach how to ask for and give feedback. This is not something that naturally can happen with simply swapping papers and expecting, based on instruction and practice, for students to know how to be able to do this. And so I always like to either do a lot of practice as a group, showing how feedback and peer editing can look. I also like to have a set of questions that students need to be able to answer in order to give feedback, so that the feedback is neutral or specifically directed about the writing and not the writer. And of course, we have guidelines about how we interact with one another about our writing, because it's so personal and not everybody feels comfortable having others look at their writing yet, or are still feeling a little self-conscious about some of the mistakes that they're making. Of course, you can also use a form. There are plenty of forms out there for peer review. The other thing that I spend time doing with learners is both collaborative and independent writing and editing. So thinking about it as scaffolding, I might use this, a think aloud, to go through how I would edit a piece of writing. And in this instance, I would use a student's piece of writing, but not a current student's piece of writing. So I like to save samples of learner writing and ask permission to use them without their names on them in future teaching activities. And if I have their permission, then I save them in various phases of their drafts so that I can use them specifically for this purpose. And then we go through the I do, we do, you do process, and everybody gets a chance at seeing and hearing and practicing what we mean when we're saying that we're editing or revising for certain traits. You can, of course, as I think we already mentioned this, build a class story, either one word at a time or one sentence at a time, even without it being a graffiti activity, and then edit it together as well. The other thing that I know has been popular in the past, and I'm not sure how widely used it still is, but there can be a place for rubrics in the intermediate literacy level for writing. But I want to say some caveats here. When I use rubrics or engage learners in the experience of developing rubrics, I have some pretty tight guidelines. I always use exemplars for everything that is described in the rubric, so that the words that describe the evaluation of that trait are exemplified by a piece of writing. And actually, very recently, Dylan Willem, whom I'm a big fan of, shifted his thinking very recently in a blog that I will share in the summary. He shifted his thinking away from rubrics and now promotes the use of exemplars instead. I actually like to use both. But again, like I said, I keep them pretty tight. So I only use rubrics that have positive language. Met, not yet, or there, almost there, on my way, things like that. I don't use language that says not met or fail or, zero. I don't even use letters, numbers, or grades at all to evaluate in a rubric. So there's only neutral or positive words in the descriptors and in the naming of the traits that you have on the rubric. I also, in a way to keep them simple, never use more than 2 or 3 qualifying columns in the continuum, if that makes sense. Some of the rubrics you might have seen might have 6, 7, 8 things that are being evaluated, and or they might be able to be scored for, a 0 up to 12. I don't make those fine distinctions. I want them to get to the act of writing, and I want them to really understand that when they're using a rubric, they're comparing their work to an exemplar and able to identify what the differences are and either get help or know what they need to do in order to get their writing to the next level. So I just wanted to make that give the overview about how I approach the use of rubrics. I also really love incorporating the students in developing the language of the rubrics. I don't like to have a rubric that says, the mechanics and the grammar is correct, and then the next column says it's not correct. That doesn't tell the learner what they need to do to be a better writer. So that's what I meant when I say to use neutral or positive descriptors. It has to say exactly what it is happening, what the writing looks like in order to be effective as a tool for students to make comparison. And then, as I said, have the exemplar. The last thing I do when I'm teaching the editing phase of writing is to only have students edit for one trait at a time. So for example, the first time after their first draft, we might only look at organization, and feedback is only welcome on organization or sequence in which they have their thoughts. It might be development and support of ideas. It might be word choice. It might be the impact on the reader, going back to purpose and audience. But I always keep grammar and spelling mechanics for last. Any ideas why? Thoughts in the chat? I know that there are some evidence-based practices that say to start with the grammar and the spelling. I do it in reverse. Okay. Yep, I see a lot of insecurity, scary, fear. I love that Joyce said, things change with editing. Grammar has baggage. I agree with Tanya. I agree that it builds confidence. I don't know that it's necessarily the least important, but I do agree that it can be the least interesting to teach. So I love the comments that I'm seeing here, because I think that a lot of us have some PTSD around our Warner's grammar text. At least I know I do. So one of the things that I haven't seen yet in terms of the answers, so I've seen that the words in the writing will change, so it wouldn't make sense to edit grammar and spelling if those are the words that can be changed. It can be very defeating to some, you've said that. It's not all equally important. I think some of you have said that. But I would also add that it hasn't traditionally been taught in a very engaging or exciting way. Yes, discouraging. So now we're talking about moving on, and I see that some of you are doing this, writing about this, so that when we're talking about proofreading as the next step in editing, and I really make a distinction between proofreading and editing, because editing and revising is around improving the quality of what you've written. But proofreading is really checking for what we would have called typos or just things that you've overlooked or made a mistake about. And so once the editing process is complete, the final task is obviously proofreading, but I don't spend a lot of time on this. And in order to really focus on the aspect of proofreading that is just making sure that there aren't any mistakes that I know the correct way to do, but I haven't, I've missed a word or misspelled a word or missed something on spell check because there's 2 different ways to spell it, things like that. I really make the distinction that proofreading is really just around making sure that you pick up those errors. So I use 2 techniques that I find to be quite effective. And I use these because I do like the proofreading stage to be brief and effective. So the first you're probably aware of is that you have the student read the text out loud. So I always have the student do that first and to make corrections as they go. And they do not have to do that in front of me. But then I task them with listening to at least one other person read their writing out loud to them exactly as it's written. It doesn't have to happen in the class or even with other students. But I want them to hear what they've written so that they can also catch anything that might not be as they wanted it to be in their final draft. While the second technique only detects certain kinds of mistakes, it really is fun and it requires a different approach to thinking about this stage of the writing process. If you haven't tried it, I encourage you to, because it is highly effective. And I do this with my own writing. I have the student read their work silently or out loud, 1 word at a time, backwards. Yep, really backwards, starting at the bottom, starting at the end. You might not get subject-verb agreement or all of the punctuation, but it does help them think about not just spelling, but also organization, missing words, flow, and they have to develop the context and remember it. They're also maybe by this point a little tired, if you will, at looking at their own words. And so it's kind of a fun way for them to hear the words back without being in the same order. There are a few things more demoralizing than a red inked paper. For most students, what was turned in was representative of their best work at that point in time, and after quite a bit of editing and revising. There are times, as I said earlier, when we are required to grade learners' work, or other times they simply want us to. I do this using sticky notes so that I do not mark their product. I give specific praise and lots of it, alongside corrections and prioritized recommendations for improvement. I believe the balance of praise with feedback is important, and then I give the learner the choice to revise a final time based on my feedback. So now we've gotten through all of the revisions and the editing, and we want to be able to publish. We want to share our work. We have an audience, we have a purpose, and we really want to, as I said earlier, encourage our learners to write for themselves, not necessarily for their teacher, but to know who their audience is and why they're writing. I particularly like this graphic on the top right corner, which you saw earlier in the agenda, because it does say read, think, write, publish. And so, of course, you need to be reading a lot of good writing to get ideas or learn more about content. And so I like that we haven't excluded reading from the writing process here. But when we look at all the opportunities for publishing, as the final step in writing, of course, there's as many ideas as there are students and the creativity you all have together in the room. Some of the ideas that I've either learned about or used is to share, have each student take their best journal entry, and we make a class journal. And that's something that's generally shared within the program, but can also be sent, for example, to school board members, directors. Things can be quotes and excerpts can be sent to local newspaper. There can be letters to the editor, depending on, again, purpose and audience. There's lots of opportunities for having work published either locally or more globally within the community. Danielle, thank you for mentioning Change Agent. That was one of the things I had offered to, had planned to mention. But you can, of course, with this picture of a mom reading with her daughter, you can have students write books for their family, for their children, make their own children's books, write their own stories, and as well as compile a class book. You can do a PowerPoint or a multimedia presentation involving writing, art, and music. You can start a class, school, or community newspaper. And some of the things that I've done is use opportunities for gift giving occasions to have students pull all their writing together, and they really care about their editing and revising and proofreading when they know that these are going to be given as gifts. So for one quick example, I had, again, same class. So we had our full complement of teen moms, and as we were coming up to the end of the spring semester, they were really discouraged that they had a long summer with their kids at home and not a lot to do that cost money, that didn't cost money. And so they decided to come up with their own book and make a book of all the things that they could do in our county that was free or low cost. And they researched, so we incorporated technology skills, there was artwork in there, and of course, all stages of the writing process. And then not only did we publish it, but they had something they could use for the summer. And when some of their friends saw it or other family members, they gave it as gifts for Mother's Day or for summer birthdays and other kinds of occasions that were graduation, other kinds of things that were special to them. Another time, our learners wanted some money to do, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I believe it was a field trip. And so there was, of course, a narrative essay in the application. And as part of their assignment in writing class, guess what they did? They wrote the narrative. They also, in math class, developed the budget. And once their application was accepted, they were required to prepare, now more writing, a speech and a presentation for a panel to be reviewed for acceptance. They did get the grant, and they were able to have some pretty enjoyable literacy-based activities for their families over the summer. So I just wanted to give some examples of really authentic experiences for writing that are meaningful and relevant. So I'm looking at the time, and I just wanted to say a couple of things about these books that are here. My very favorite book in this whole list, and I will have this in the summary, but I wanted to say a couple things about them. Evergreen, A Guide to Writing with Readings, is my favorite resource on here, And one of the things that I specifically like about it is that it has samples of student writing. And so we're not only reading published famous authors, but also having an opportunity to see what student writing looks like so that an exemplar is realistic for our learners. You beat me to it, Danielle, thank you. Yes, News for You and Journey to Success, I think, are two great resources from New Readers Press. Lots of opportunities for life-based writing there. And I also wanted to mention that Writing from the Heart, or there's a new book called Write from the Heart by Leslie Newman, gives a whole, it's really a whole text of writing prompts with her own samples. And so I like that because, again, exemplars, and then learners can use that same prompt and write their own responses or reflections or essays, or learn more about things based on those writing prompts. Stephen King's book on writing is a memoir of the craft. I tend to just use specific chapters from this, but I will say that he does write quite a bit about his discouragement as a writer, as well as all the times that he was rejected before he became famous. And I think it's really good for students to hear from an author that they like and read, to know that he was not immediately successful. Steve posted this in the chat, and I have it right here. The Teal Teaching Excellence in Adult Literacy Just Right Guide is about 10 years old. It's not for use with students, it's for the teachers, but it is a document that's free to download that is a great guide for teachers or tutors. And then of course you can get your graphic organizers for writing free online. So I realized that I did go right up to almost the hour in an attempt to hopefully give you some things that you're ready to start or try or energized about in your classes. I am happy to answer any questions. And of course, I am, as Todd said, willing to stay on to answer any of them directly, or for you to keep them and hold them in for signing up for a coaching session and bring them to those opportunities, because oftentimes others have the same question.
All right, thank you, Anne-Marie. Yeah, we've got some questions, and let me just encourage people. One, I know folks may have been planning and can't stay on, so if you have to get off, thank you very much for attending. As we said, we will send you out a follow-up email with the recording and other information. You'll have the links for the small group coaching sessions where Anne-Marie has agreed to share some additional activities and strategies and things like that. But if you do have the time and want to stick around, we do have some questions. We'll give you a few minutes to get your questions into the Q&A. I want to remind you to please type them in the Q&A so we can track them. And then we'll get started answering those, and you're welcome to stick around and hear Anne-Marie's answers. And if you can't stick around, the answers will be on the recording. So, okay, our first one, Anne-Marie, is you talked about this was a kind of a workshop for intermediate writers. And the question was just, what criteria or how would you define an intermediate writer versus a beginning writer?
That's such a great question. And I think that the quickest and easiest way to address that is by doing what we did in the last webinar, and that's saying that I never like hearing these words come out of my mouth, but sometimes for clarity's sake, we need to use grade levels in order to get somewhat of a shared concept of what we mean about that development of writing. And so all of the activities and strategies that I've shared today are appropriate for and used with students who are reading at about a 3rd to 8th grade level. And then I do take a writing sample, but I find that if they're reading of course, usually stronger than their writing, as long as they can read what we need to do. The process of writing comes along a lot more quickly for improvement than reading. So I'm looking at that when I say intermediate level, 3rd to 8th grade reading level.
Okay, that makes sense. Question from Molly. Any opinions on using audiobooks or podcasts and then writing an essay on the topic? So having the students listen to audiobooks as opposed to, you talked about reading something and then writing about the topic, but thoughts about using audiobooks or podcasts and kind of doing that same activity?
So I do have a thought about this, and I welcome if you have a different one, Todd. I know that there's research that shows that the process that we go through in terms of listening in some ways mirrors the reading process, but call it old school, call it a stickler. I just really like students seeing words and seeing how a writer uses punctuation, uses how the words are spelled, how they go together, how the ideas are organized. And so for me, if I want the students to hear a poet, for example, read their work in their own words, I see value to that. But for me, and I think that you can certainly encourage students to write about anything, whether they've heard about it or listened to a book on tape, but I don't consider, this is my personal opinion, listening to a story the same as reading a story, and it doesn't give an exemplar of what good writing looks like. But it does give information about voice and description, descriptive words. So I'm not saying there isn't value to it. When I offer this as an option, it's something that they do outside of class time.
Yeah, I think I would kind of come down on the side of, I think I probably agree with you in terms of just, I would rely more on reading and then writing about what you're reading. I think it is easier for students to see the words and the sentences and how they're put together, and kind of analyze that to help them become better writers. I do think that there are certain things where certain features of writing where hearing it is beneficial. I'm thinking about like poetry, where it's a lot easier to kind of hear the rhyming and the cadence of something.
Yep,
I
definitely.
do a writing activity with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream.
I was just going to say that. I do that too, yes.
Yeah. And we talk about like, in creative writing, the use of like kind of a repeated structure or imagery or things like that and its impact. And I think in those situations, that comes through a lot better a lot of times when you can hear it. So I think it's not something that I would say don't do, but I think,
right.
Yeah, I think it's fine to kind of incorporate it in and mix it up. But yeah.
Yeah, and it makes me think too of readers' theater,
Yes.
In terms of writing and looking at good writing and reading. I think that when you think about, I have used Martin Luther King's speech and poetry in particular as things because I want this, but for a very specific purpose. And I share this with the students because I say, what I want you to hear is how the words come alive, or why certain words were selected, how repetition is effective. When you read it, it might be a little, why am I reading this over and over again? But when you hear it, that goes back to the words have power and my voice is coming through. But I also want them to first be able to develop that with word selection. I want them to be inspired to be able to write like that and understand that sometimes your audience is a group of people for whom you're giving a speech. And then especially with once we start getting into, you have to be a really good writer to then start breaking the rules, right? Around grammar and punctuation and then hearing the author deliver their writing as it's intended to be read and heard.
Yeah.
So certainly there's a place for it. But I did have a teacher tell me that that because the writing process and reading process was because the reading process was so similar to the listening process, that they'd done away with reading in intermediate level ABE classes and were now doing only books on tape, because they felt it was better for the students to get exposed to the literature and hearing what good writing sounds like, rather than teaching them to read. And professionally, that is not how I approach it for writing or reading.
Yeah, me either. I think you're right on that. Great question from Sydney. Can you recommend a word game or games for sentence development?
Oh my goodness, Mad Libs is really fun. You can get so many of them. Sometimes we've done Boggle, nice and kinesthetic, but it also, you have to be able to say what the word, spell it correctly and say what the word means and come up with synonyms. We do it that way, or we take everybody's words and then make sentences about them. Another one is I've had students make their own crossword puzzles. And so the sentences they're writing are the clues. So this is a vocabulary enriching activity as well as a writing activity, because they have to write a sentence, not just a fragment for the clue. And then they each develop their own crossword puzzle and then swap it with other people in the class. And they get feedback on the quality of their sentence based on whether or not the clues are specific enough or accurate enough for the right word to go in. So they've really liked doing that. I'm trying to think, there was something, I'm sorry that I just can't come up with it off the top of my head, but there is a fun synonym game. Well, Taboo is a fun game to play. It's a little bit opposite, but you can't use certain words to describe a concept, a word, or an idea. And then this is really more about developing rich vocabulary. But games for sentence development, well, of course, remember those magnetic poetry box sets that we had a couple decades ago? I mean, that's really what words on the magnetic cookie sheets are. Any words off a word wall, any words that the students bring in, any words from the writing. And then, of course, there are some really cool things in News for You, or just books of word games. I brought those in too. You don't have to develop it all yourself.
Yeah, I've got a couple of games that I've used with students. So one is I've had students write kind of a very structured, I think you and I talked about this, write a very structured 5-word sentence like the boy threw the ball.
Yep.
And then we kind of go through and we build on that sentence, adding, the first thing we do is we add an adjective to each noun. So it might be the tall boy threw the red ball. Then we add an adverb. Then we add a prepositional phrase. Then we add another adjective to each of the nouns. And now you have a third noun with the prepositional phrase. But it's just a way to kind of build from a very simple sentence that especially low-level students can write, and then kind of build it out. And it also helps students see what parts of speech do and add to a sentence. So that's one that can kind of be really fun. And we do it as a group. So each person in the class writes their own sentence, and then we go through the process. I'm kind of walking them through the process, and then we come back and we share our sentences after each step to kind of see how they've grown in detail. The other one I've done is sentence relays, where I'll divide the class into 2 groups, and we'll set a number of words, like you're going to write sentences of 25 words or more. And I'll put a word up on the board for each group. So it'll be foot, and you have a big chalkboard, and I put one foot on the left and foot on the right. And then the idea is they're in a line and they have to relay race and add one word to the sentence on either side, until they develop a complete sentence. And then they can go, if their complete sentence is not up to 25 words or however many we've decided, then they have to write another sentence and kind of do the same thing. And their sentence, the only rule is their sentence has to make sense. You know,
Yes.
so
Yes.
but the next person writes, a big, so it's big foot, and then kind of so on, and that's fun. And we do those activities. So that's a couple of
Mhm.
games. We had a question from Susan.
Can I add one quick thing to what
Absolutely.
you just said? It reminded me that another sentence activity that I would do is whenever there was an upcoming holiday or an event, Halloween, for example, I would say, what are the emotions associated with that holiday for you? And then have them write a sentence that elicits the most fear. Then we would talk about, well, how do authors elicit fear and a certain emotion? Valentine's Day or Mother's Day or Christmas, and Hanukkah. And so I understand that not everybody celebrates every holiday, but you can also use things from the current events for this too. So just starting with, something that everybody in the class knows, gratitude or gratefulness around Thanksgiving, not making it about food. And then what is the one emotion you want to evoke? And you get one sentence to do it. And how do people who are really good at writing sentences, then you bring in Edgar Allan Poe, or you bring in, Chicken Soup from the Soul for gratitude, things like this about families and or communication or love. And love doesn't have to be romantic love for Valentine's Day. So you get lots of, how do writers use words and the arrangement of words to evoke a specific emotion, and how to do that in one sentence. And I've had really good success with that.
Excellent.
Yes, there's another question. I apologize.
No, that's okay. Do the ELL references address writing in those populations? I'm not sure what ELL references Nan is talking about.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question either.
Yeah. And then we had a question from Susan about, can you give us examples of rubrics that you use? So you talked a lot about rubrics and kind of described what they are. Maybe that's something that you can share in the resources that we share out to people in the follow-up email, or maybe something that you can kind of share some of your rubrics if people want to sign up for your coaching sessions.
Yes. And in the interest of time, I will say that I am a very big fan of having the students develop the rubrics, and I've had extensive training and I'm pretty skilled at facilitating that. And I think it's worth the time. There's great value in having the students do that with exemplars. But yes, I will just say off the top of my head, the 6+1 traits are really pretty well done. But I do weed out a bunch of them that don't meet the criteria that I think is helpful to students. So I can definitely provide that resource in the summary sheet.
Okay, that's great. We have a question from Carol. I'm looking for resources to self-measure progress as a student. So what can a student use to kind of evaluate their own progress as a writer?
I think that's really what the gift of the extensive editing process in class or during the instructional time offers the opportunity for, because you can, it can be anything from, well, first of all, I start with asking the students, how will you know? How will you know when your writing has improved? I want their input too, because like I said, we can't have every exemplar be a published famous author. That's not a realistic goal for most people, never mind, emerging writers. But I can say that when I've asked students how they know that they're making progress, I've gotten everything from, I have fewer eraser marks on my paper.
Completely legitimate.
Completely legitimate. I never would have thought of that. It was brilliant. And I've had students talk about how few, when they run it through spell check on the computer, that they like that there's fewer things to correct. But also, I think just, one of the beauties of the peer editing process and using the Post-it notes for feedback is that they get to keep that and see both the depth of the comments and the feedback from each other and from me or other volunteers working in the program, but they also get to start sharing their work with other people along the way. And so they start really organically getting feedback from others. And so, like everything else, we start with purpose and audience, but what do you want the outcome to be? Just like I said, if it's Halloween, what emotion are you trying to elicit? Well, what do you want the reader to leave with? Why are you writing this? That's your purpose. Who's your audience? What do you know about them? And so, if it's a persuasive argument, then you can know if you made progress in your writing by whether or not somebody believed in or bought your argument, right? Whether or not you changed their thinking. But if it's a different kind of writing, I really just want them to see that, like you said, if you've got a 5-word sentence and it's rather dry and doesn't elicit a lot of response or emotion or even give enough information, I just go back to a lot of compare and contrast. And I do have students save every draft. So one of the things we do at the end before publishing is pull out the first draft. And it's for them to see how much better their writing is and why it's a certain way based on not just the feedback they got, but the revisions they made. So I think that it's somewhat organic, but built into the process of seeing that this is what all writers do. And I think that's one of my favorite things about teaching writing is how quickly you can see progress as well as harness the enthusiasm or inspire and encourage writers very early on. Whereas with reading, it can take longer. But with writing, people have a lot to say. And if they know someone's going to be an audience, it's a nice way to get away from a lot of the things on social media are always having texts and snaps that are just, abbreviations or a couple of words. I really like that aspect of developing things in a way that it doesn't always have to be longer to be better, but richer and more robust and elicit the response you're going for.
Great. And then our last question, I think actually is a good transition to your next webinar. So Joanne asked, do you have any tips for adult literacy classes and writing? Our students speak English, but read at a kindergarten to 3rd grade level. And if I'm not mistaken, Anne-Marie, that is exactly what your next webinar is going to be on, effective strategies for working with low-level basic literacy learners on April 13th. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, exactly.
Perfect. So Joanne, I think we would encourage you to sign up for that webinar. And that's all of our questions. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for sticking around and hearing Anne-Marie's answers to your questions. Anne-Marie, thank you again for a fantastic workshop. And again, encourage you guys to sign up for those coaching sessions if you want to have a more in-depth conversation with Anne-Marie about writing. She's got, I know from talking with her and working with her on this workshop, she's got a lot of fantastic ideas. All right, I think that's it. Thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing people in the coaching sessions, and I'll be glad to expand and help you get started or tweak or develop any of these. And I want to add in closing, there was a question about teaching writing in an online class and how to do feedback digitally. I'm very happy to address that in coaching.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.